Hi, I'm Katie Bell Perkins, and I'm going to be covering Chapter 30, the Americas in the Age of Independence, kind of covering the middle part, migration to the Americas, and America economic expansion, and kind of specifically focusing on Canada and the United States with a little bit of Latin America. So, kind of the main theme and context of my slides is American economic development through the 19th and 20th century. And kind of the two principal influences that helped with that development was migration and British capital. So, the United States and Canada absorbed migration and exploited foreign capital to build industrial societies to establish economic independence for their new countries. Now, the fragmented states of Latin America weren't as lucky. They really struggled to accept the same circumstances when dealing with a legacy of colonialism, and they had established economic dependence of a single export of a cash crop like coffee or sugar. Um, Migrants worked in fields rather than factories when they migrated to Latin America rather than America. So, newly freed men and women in America, while some were small landowners after slavery ended, many found themselves under control of the same elites, or they found themselves under sharecropping, which is when a landowner gives a tenant land in return for a share of the crops they produce. So, pretty self explanatory. So, the arduous labor endured by them helped for the economic growth and independence of America, um, but in return, the country was built on the backs of many and only got gained by a few. But the migration to the Americas was part with the growth of the economy, came with an influx of migration from Europe and Asia to the US, Canada, and Latin America. Internal migration had Latin Americans coming to the US for financial stability and people in America moving west towards manifest destiny and gold prospects to the California gold rush in 1849. Others went looking for gold in Canada as well. Millions of European and Asian migrants worked on railroad construction sites, plantations, and in factories. Um, the more fascinating effect to me is the support jobs that kind of came along, other than kind of those three basic immigration jobs, which was like restaurants or churches or just like support jobs that shaped kind of the burgeoning American and Canadian and Latin American cultures. Like the migrant Fat Hing Chen opened a restaurant in Chinatown to feed the migrant workers in San Francisco. Because along with themselves, a person brings their food, religion, and tradition, which cultivates a society's culture and aspects into kind of a new mixture. So, industrial migrants from Europe in the mid 1800s, the majority of them migrated to North America. In the budding industrial economy of the US, they filled the factories because they needed little skill and low labor costs to operate machinery and perform heavy labor. In 1850, the count of Europeans in America numbered about 2.3 million. Driven by debt and high rent, migrants came from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Scandinavia. Some sought cheap land towards from the Idaho and the Mississippi River, but many stayed in the eastern states to work in the factories. By the end of the 19th century, however, the main intake of migrants to the Americas was Poles, Russian Jews, Slavs, Italians, Greeks, and Portuguese. They were the majority workforce in the textile industry, and without the rate of industrial expansion in the US during the late 19th century would have been impossible. So industrial migrants from Asia in the 1840s, Chinese migration swelled due to the deployment of gunboat diplomacy by the British on the Qing dynasty. So gunboat diplomacy is when British gunboats use small squads of warships sailing into a strategic area to leverage negotiations. Because if you remember from chapter 26, the Qing dynasty in 1680 only allowed British agents to trade in Zhuangzhou, and in 1793 the emperor then stated to King George III that we don't need England, you need China. So after successful coercion, approximately 200,000 Chinese migrants flooded America in 1852 to 1875, mainly on indentured servitude contracts. and approximately 5,000 migrated to British Columbia in search of gold, and others worked on the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Many came to California as indentured servants to work on the Central Pacific Railroad or to cultivate crops. Some Chinese migrants, however, found passage on their own in search of building their own fortune instead of having to rely on working themselves out of a contract. So, plantation migrants were predominantly in Latin America. However, there was a small section that went to the Pacific Islands in America, like Hawaii. So, the European ones, due to the lack of industrialization in America, they fed into plantations there. So, about 4 million Italians sought opportunities in Argentina, and Brazil paid Italian immigrants to work on coffee plantations, and they were doing so because of the giant labor loss of emancipation of slavery. And even though they paid many of these immigrants, many migrated between Latin America and Europe to take full advantage of each planting season that differed from the northern and southern hemispheres. So from Asia, plantation migrants in the 19th century in Cuba had a surge of about 15,000 Chinese migrants to work in the sugarcane plantations. Indian migrants traveled to the Caribbean islands like Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, or Guyana. Migrants from China and Japan moved to Peru to work cotton plantations and build railroad lines. From 1815 to 1860, expanding U.S. influence through industrialization brought in about 25,000 Chinese and about 180,000 Japanese to work the sugarcane fields in Hawaii. It also influenced the Filipino and Korean to migrate to the Pacific Islands as well. So, economic expansion in the U.S. Due to British capital, the initial investment led to the establishment of the U.S. textile industry, and after that return of capital, several entrepreneurs were able to open coal and iron ore mines, steel and iron factories, and build railroads. And the U.S. industry expansion was a direct consequence of the recent industry boom in England. English businessmen had created enormous wealth from their industrial revolution that they had just gone through, and they needed somewhere with gainful opportunity to invest their recent funds. They saw a wide governed U.S. grounds as a place of possible economic independence. And so by doing so, through these investments, they created a rival industrial power, and the U.S. eventually surpassed England's economy. After the Civil War, the U.S. established a continental economy resting on wage labor. And a continental economy is a combination of canals, highways, and railroads to transport goods nationwide. And it can be national because there's a national market, but good transportation essentially. So it's basically a national market is established through transportation and supply and demand. So economic expansion in the U.S. was really dependent on the railroads, which you'll see through the next 3 slides. So to establish the railways, it established the national economy in the 19th century for the U.S. And the U.S. offered industrial and natural resources from the beginning, but because of the vast size and diversity of the nation, it made it difficult for completion until the railroad boom. It created for better transportation, communication, and a distribution network. In the 1900s, U.S. railroads stretched for about 200,000 miles long, which was essentially coast to coast. Railroads were cheap transportation for agricultural goods, manufactured goods, and people. So the Plain States was able to transport beef, grain, and hogs. The South was able to transport cotton and tobacco. Northwest was able to transport lumber. Pittsburgh was able to transport iron and steel from their mills. And the eastern cities were able to transport their finished industrial products all at a cheaper cost than from previous. So to continue on, the advantage of the railways, they supported other industries' growth as well. Trains consumed a lot of coal and required glass, lumber, and rubber to run and to construct. In the 1880s, the railroad industry used approximately 75% of the steel manufactured in the U.S., and the railroad was also in new unfounded territory. It was a large-scale business that needed managerial skills to operate the systems that the U.S. and the small-scale railroad system previously had never seen before. the Pennsylvania Railroad Company alone employed an unprecedented 50,000 people to operate it. It was a new type of big business that paved the path for many companies later on how to run. Many were worried about the exploitation and wear of natural resources that railroads were creating. Others were concerned with the continued disrespect of indigenous people land by building these railroads on them, but most and the majority just saw it as the expansion of industry. By 1883, local times were still being observed, making a train schedule impossible to keep. So the U.S. railroad companies came together and established 4 time zones across the U.S. that were officially adopted by the government in 1918. In 1817 to 1819, fueled by the railroad system, the economy and innovation grew. With that innovation, there were electric lights, telephones, typewriters, phonographs, moving pictures as well. There was tons of innovation, and with consumer demand, it ensured prosperity. But there was a moment with labor strikes, including the 1877 Pullman strike, that halted corporations until the backing of state and federal governments made the U.S. one of the major industrial powers. So, just for a little history on the Pullman strike, essentially, workers were living in a community built by Pullman cars, and they got low wages, but the rents were high, and it was unable to afford them, and so there was a large-scale railroad strike preventing a lot of travel and transporting of goods, and it took about 100 lives in a riot, and it took about $10 million in property damages. But with the backing of federal government, like I said, everything basically came back, and U.S. prosperity was right back on track. So with Canadian prosperity, it kind of came with the National Policy, which was a political group. So in the early 19th century, Britain wanted to discourage the separatist movement, so they paid a high price for a Canadian agricultural product. So as a result of that, British colonies in Canada retained a high quality of living pre-industrialization. With the establishment of the Dominion, which is the Dominion of Canada, politicians created the national policy to protect future interests, attract migrants, and construct a national transportation system. So they wanted to have Western settlement, protective tariffs, and a railroad, essentially, along with that. So they eventually created the Canadian Pacific Railroad, which finished in 1885, which was funded by British capital, like many ventures in the U.S. were. It promoted the emergence of a Canadian national economy, just like the American railroad system promoted a national economy. In the early 20th century, Canada's economy and population surged to 2.7 million, partly due, the 2.7 million was from Eastern European migrants, and there was also a large increase in population from natural increase. The national policy created a prosperous agricultural, mineral, and industrial-based economy. So Canadian prosperity, it was kind of intertwined with the U.S., and it still can be seen today. So Canada initially remained watchful of the U.S. In the 19th century, British investments in the U.S. slowed, allowing the Canadian economy to grow at a more competitive rate. And the U.S. started to become more involved with Canada's economy, and by 1918, the U.S. owned 30% of the Canadian industries. Both economies became interdependent of each other, and Ontario, and an example of that is Ontario had rapid industrialization during the earliest 20th century due to the prosperous industrialization of the northeastern states in the U.S. So the economies in America and Canada, you can really see were helped through British capital migration and the establishment of the railroad system, which were kind of the 3 main points that I gathered from the chapter.